Adrian is an educator, an artist, a researcher. It's all yours. Go, my friend.
Thank you. So can you hear me clearly?
Yes,
Okay, good.
we get on the sound system
You get me on the sound system. Good.
here, so it's real good.
Okay. So, so this is brought to you. I'm on the Adult Education Committee at Congregation and Shai. So this is brought to you courtesy of Congregation and Shai. When I grew up, I'm going to close a couple of things. I'm going to close my video so you can't see me because I wave my hands a lot. And then I'm going to reduce your image, but I'll come back and so I can see this. Okay, now we're set. So
Yeah, what you do in your screen doesn't make any difference to us.
yeah, I don't, good. It was good. So when I grew up, little girls did not have, or certainly in my neighborhood, didn't have bat mitzvahs, but boys did. And they always seemed to have these wonderful projects. So last year, I reached a significant age, one that I could have a bat mitzvah. And so I did, and I wanted a project. And so I combined my love of art and Jewish art. And that's what these three art talks are all about. And today, we're going to be starting a 3-part series that highlights some of the world's most famous modern artists, all of them Jewish. This list is by no means definitive, and there were really, truly a lot of artists to choose from. One French study estimated that over 500 Jewish artists were working in Paris from the start of the 20th century to the start of World War II. So I thought that was amazing. Today, we'll be focusing on a half a dozen artists who lived in Montparnasse and an artist commune called La Roche. Each one of today's artists deserves an entire art essay devoted to them. And I have high hopes in the future that I'll do some of that. But for today, let's consider this a little nosh. If you have a question, write it in chat if you're online, or just write it down, and I'll try to answer them at the end of my talk. So let's begin at the beginning, at least. These Dura Europa synagogue walls are adorned with narrative paintings that tell a story. These murals are the earliest known examples of Jewish art, and they're from 244 CE, the Common Era. These synagogue murals call for the restoration of the Jewish people to temple ritual and to their land. This treasure trove of narrative paintings establishes, beyond a doubt, an ancient source of Jewish art and visual tradition in Jewish culture. This mural features Mordecai and Esther and is found on the wall of the Dura Europa synagogue. It is thought that the synagogue was used in part, and these walls were used in part as an instructional display to educate and teach history and the laws of the religion, our religion. Dura Europa was uncovered in 1928. There's another date that says it was 1932, so I guess you can take your choice. But right now, it's in the National Museum in Damascus. These narrative murals are contemporaneous. They existed at the same time as similar Greco-Roman works. and predated Christian narrative art by over 300 years. So now we're going to skip many centuries forward to appraise the impact that Jewish artists had on modern art. Starting in mid-1890s, painters began to abandon the idea of copying the world around them and stopped using the canvas like a window where you would display people or places or things. Several factors impelled modernist art movement, specifically the invention of photography in the 19th century, the discovery of electricity and psychology, were all its exploration of all this unconsciousness in our minds. Therein, opening the possibility of a non-material reality, and this provided a wealth of inspiration for artists. Dreams, fantasy, symbolism, personal history, and mythology were suddenly suitable subjects for art. Visual and emotional sensations were emphasized over exacting replication. The portrayal of the subject and how the subject was portrayed was based solely on what the artist saw, what the artist felt, what the artist envisioned. Modernist art moved away from representing people, places, and things to the less tangible arena of ideas and emotions. And once that move began, what better neighborhood to move into than Montparnasse in Paris? Montparnasse has been part of Paris since 1669. It's an area in the south of France, the south of Paris, on the left bank of the Seine River. From the start of the 20th century to the start of World War II, Paris artistic circles migrated to Montparnasse as an alternative to Montmartre, a district. Montmartre was a district that overlooks Paris, and that had been the intellectual breeding ground for the previous, more well-to-do and supported generation of artists. Montparnasse became known as the heart of the intellectual and artistic life of Paris and the Mecca for starving artists. Virtually penniless painters, sculptors, writers, poets, and composers came from around the world to thrive in the creative atmosphere and for the cheap rent that at artist communes such as La Roche. It is said that poverty was a luxury in Montparnasse. The cafes and the bars of Montparnasse were meeting places where ideas were hatched and mulled over. These were the places where starving artists could occupy a table all evening for a few centimes. If they happened to fall asleep, the waiters were instructed not to wake them. Arguments were common. Some were fueled by intellect, others by alcohol. And if there were fights, and often there were, the police were never summoned. If you couldn't pay your bill, a proprietor would often accept a drawing, holding it until you could play. As such, there were times when cafe walls were littered with a collection of artworks that today would cost millions and millions and millions of dollars to procure. By the way, these same cafes are still in business today. Our first artist lived in Montparnasse. He made important contributions to both Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. Art historian John Rewall called this artist the Dean of Impressionist painters, not only because he was the oldest, but also because, and I quote, by virtue of his wisdom and his balanced kind, and warm-hearted personality. Paul Cézanne said, "He was a father to me, a man to consult, and a little like the good Lord." And he was also one of Paul Gauguin's masters. I'd like to introduce you to Camille Pissarro. Pissarro was born in St. Thomas in the Virgin Islands to a Portuguese Sephardic Jewish family. Pissarro lived in St. Thomas until 12, when he was sent to a boarding school in Paris. Now, above his name, I wrote his birth name, and then the name that he became known as professionally. Some of the artists I'll present in this series changed their names. And as I said, I placed the birth name over the popularized one. In this case, Pissarro shortened his, but some names were changed dramatically, as you will see. In many cases, Jewish name changing was the result of anti-Semitism in the first half of the 20th century. Several artworks were stolen by the Nazis from Jewish families, and they have been at the center of court cases in Europe in recent years. This particular one, this particular painting, which is called Picking Peas, was at the center of it just a few years ago. In October 2018, an American couple lost their bid to keep ownership of this painting, Picking Peas, which was looted from a French Jewish collector during World War II. The American couple who bought it at auction for $800,000 argued that they had no idea it was looted. Simon Burrell, the original owner, survived the war, but only because a strike by railroad workers stopped the train that was taking him to the concentration camp. His family rediscovered the painting existed when it was put on loan by the couple to a museum. And in they walked to a museum, and there's their father's painting. His descendants were granted their request to assume ownership of the 1887 painting. Pissarro, and I hope you can see this clearer on a big screen. Pissarro used the technique of pointillism in this work, which was pioneered by George Seurat and Paul Signac. Now, Pissarro is most associated with pointillism, but the truth is it was a technique he adapted when he was 54 years old. This new technique involved using tiny adjacent dots of pure color. If you look closer, you can see that. These dots of pure color then blended in the human eye to create a luminous effect. Pissarro liked to depict people in their natural environment, working in cooperation with one another to get their tasks done. And he really appreciated what he called honest labor. Remarkably, it wasn't until 1892, when Pissarro was 62 years old, that there was a large and successful retrospective of Pissarro's work, and for the first time, the artist achieved some financial stability. Montmartre Boulevard at night is one of 14 views that Pissarro painted between February and April 1897. Painting this motif of the boulevard in the morning, in the afternoon, in the evening, and at night, in the mist, in fog, in snow, and sunlight. He clearly was selling them. And he painted from an upper story, very expensive, spacious hotel room in the Grand Hotel de Rousset on the boulevard, Montmartre Boulevard. Now, I chose this self-portrait because he looks to me like a Zeta, a grandpa. When I searched for his association, any information on his association with his Jewish faith, I found the following correspondence. In 1859, his father, Frederick, sent Camille a letter on the eve of Yom Kippur, reminding him about the holiday. And I quote, "Your mother asked me to write you to come and have dinner with us tonight, because this is the evening when we celebrate La Fête de Kippur. And on this solemn occasion, the whole family should be together, and tomorrow not work. We should pass that day together." That sounds like my father calling me when I lived in Boston and they were in New York. When I read this, I thought his parents must have felt that his son was disengaged from his religion and needed a little reminder about the high holy days. But Pissarro didn't really abandon his faith. Years later, Pissarro wrote a cousin in St. Thomas about his father, Frederick's death, and said, "God is great. He took away what was dearest to us in the world. We have to bow and believe in his providence." The groundbreaking, world-famous Jewish artist that I am introducing today lived alongside of many of the world's great artists and writers of this period. They lived and frequented LaRouche. Jane Warnock, in her book called LaRouche, describes it as a place of poverty, the ghetto, anarchy, individualism, and the universe of Kafka. But few places have ever housed such artistic talent. Today, works by some of these poor, really starving artists, residents, and their close friends sell in the millions and millions of dollars. This is LaRouche. It exists today. It is an old 3-story circular structure that got its name because it looks much like a large beehive rather than a dwelling fit for human beings. Now, I thought this was interesting. It originally was a temporary building designed by Gustav Eiffel for use as a wine rotunda at the Great Exposition of 1900. The structure, after the exposition, was dismantled and re-erected as low-cost studios for artists. And Alfred Bouchard, a sculptor, was the fellow who did this amazing project. He wanted to help young artists by providing them with shared models and exhibition space open to all the residents. At LaRouche, the rent was very cheap and no one was evicted for non-payment. Luckily, I found a picture of the studios. This will give you the idea of the studio where they lived and worked. They lived without running water in damp, unheated studios, and many of them sold their work for a few francs just to buy food. But as I said, very few places in the world have ever housed such artistic talent as found at LaRouche. Our next artist, also who lived in LaRouche, said, "I want to be a tuned, swept fiddle string that feels the master's melody and snaps." That seems a prophetic saying from an artist that lived a short, intense life and died young. I would like to introduce you to Amedeo Modigliani. Modigliani was born into a Sephardic Jewish family in a port city in Italy that had long served as a refuge for those persecuted for their religion. And it was home to a very large Jewish community. Although Modigliani's name is always identified with Paris, he didn't move there until 1906. He was in his early 20s. Before that, he was in Leghorn. Leghorn was a gem in the Jewish world, a city whose the Medicis, rulers deliberately lured Jews from throughout the Mediterranean base with promises of religious liberty and tolerance. The result was a flowering of Jewish culture in a cosmopolitan environment that knew no ghetto walls. When Modigliani arrived in Paris in 1906, for the first time in his life, he witnessed his peers suffer anti-Semitism. And that contrasted really sharply with his more tolerant upbringing in Italy. But Modigliani was very fluent in French, thanks to his mother. And the truth is, he could blend in with the French culture. Modigliani painted many of the well-known figures in the artistic and cultural world of his time. And this is Hannah Orloff, the sculptor. She came to Paris from Mandate period Palestine and was a close friend of Modigliani. Her name, if it's possible to see, is up here in Hebrew letters, Hannah Bat Raphael. And it's if you can see it in the left upper corner. This painting held special meaning for Modigliani because it was the first painting he sold in Paris. The elongated necks, the stylized almond-shaped opaque eyes, the slightly askewed lips gave an exotic and haunting aspects to his subjects. A British poet and journalist, Beatrice Hastings, moved to Paris in 1914, where she quickly became absorbed in the thriving avant-garde scene of Montparnasse. Hastings met Modigliani, and the pair began a stormy 2-year love affair. Now it's interesting, I found it interesting, that Modigliani was influenced by some of the popular art movements of his time. He was influenced by post-impressionism, symbolism, expressionism, Fauvism, and especially Cézanne. But he espoused no theory and he participated in no artistic movement. The Romanian sculptor Constantine Brancusi persuaded Modigliani to take up sculpture. But the dust worsened Modigliani's fragile lungs, and he did not have the physical strength to cut stone. So he returned to painting, often endowing his portrait with sculptural forms. This lyrical drawing is of one of Russia's greatest poets. And I always make a mistake when I pronounce her name. Anna Akhmatova. When she was a newlywed, I thought this story was interesting. When she was a newlywed and on her honeymoon, she was introduced to Modigliani, who at the time was an unknown and struggling Italian painter. Over the years, she returned again and again and again to visit him. Modigliani made 16 drawings of Anna in the nude, one of which remained with her until her death. It always hung above her sofa during her frequently unsettled life. Again, she was known as one of Russia's greatest poets. This is another one. According to everything I read, Modigliani looked dashing in his brown corduroy coat that he wore everywhere, the bright red scarf flung around his neck, and his broad felt hat. He was very handsome. He had he had this mysterious brooding aura, and he was thought of as eccentric by his closest friends. Modigliani did crazy things in Paris, like dancing in the moonlight and getting jailed for drunkenness constantly. He was very successful at attracting women who found him quite irresistible, and he could always find willing models to paint. Modigliani was involved in one love affair after another, after another, after another, and then along came Jean. They fell deeply in love, married, and soon had a son. But life was not easy, for he was frequently in desperate financial trouble and frequently ill. In the middle of January 1920, his friends found Modigliani as he lay dying in his studio next to his distraught wife. He died of tubercular meningitis combined with the effects of too much alcohol and drugs. Modigliani died at the age of 36. The next day, his hysterical wife threw herself from a window of her parents' home. There is a record of Modigliani becoming a bar mitzvah. And well, this is a good picture. There is a record of Modigliani becoming bar mitzvah, and when he died, his friends thought it appropriate to have a rabbi officiate at the funeral. Amedeo Modigliani's handsome face, tragic love story, and early death transformed this Jewish painter into a legend. I reread this quote by Albert Einstein: "Creativity is intelligence having fun." And boy, I immediately thought of this next artist, a Russian Jewish artist I came across while doing research for this project. And I think this statement definitely applies to him. So again, if you look above the name, that's his birth name, and he became Vladimir Baronov Rossini. Not only was Baronov Rossini an avant-garde artist, he is credited as the founder of avant-garde, Cubo-futuristic, and pointillistic art movements in Russia. And he was such a marvelously and talented inventor that I want to share his inventiveness with you as I show you some of the paintings that he painted while he was at LaRouche. Baronov Rossini was born in an area that is present-day Ukraine. He studied at the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg. And from 1910 to 1914, he too was a resident of LaRouche. And the following paintings, except for the very last one, are all from that period. So alongside this beautiful piece of work, Baronoff Rossini had his first presentation of his optophonic piano during a performance at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. It was a musical instrument that was capable of creating colored lights, patterns, and textures and music simultaneously. I enjoy his style. Baronoff Rossini also perfected a machine that sterilized and distributed fizzy drinks, and that was called the Multi-Perco, which received several technical awards at the time. And this is a picture I chose to highlight that he applied the art of color to the military with the technique of camouflage or the chameleon process. And he patented it in 1934 alongside Robert Delaunay. And in the next talk next week, I'm going to feature Sonia Delaunay, who is a remarkable, remarkable woman in the talk that I'm going to do about women of substance. Baronoff Rossini also invented a photochromometer that determined the quality of precious stones. I include this painting from 1931 because it has a very haunting quality for me. And I paired it with his story. In 1925, Baronoff Rossini migrated to France. During the French occupation in World War II, Baronoff Rossini was captured and deported to Auschwitz, and there he died. Our next artist is viewed by many as a herald of American abstract expressionism. Chaim Soutine, you could see his birth name up here. Chaim Soutine was born in a Jewish village in the Lithuanian part of Western Russia in an area that is present-day Belarus. He was the 10th of 11 children. The region was plagued with anti-Semitic violence. Thousands of Jews were killed during pogroms during his childhood. I want to show you a sampling, because I don't have the original, but a sampling of what his portraits look like. So, his upbringing was fairly typical of Russian-born Jews during this era. They were forced to endure persecution and discrimination from a hostile government. In addition, Soutine's interest in drawing incurred opposition within his small community because of the belief of Talmudic prescriptions regarding images. Though his parents supported his artistic endeavors, those in the shtetl, his village, were less enamored, especially the rabbi's sons. They were so enraged after Soutine painted his father's portrait, you can see what his portraits look like here, they beat him severely, according to several biographies about the artist. Soon after the incident, Soutine left for Minsk with little more than his parents' blessings and the 25 rubles he got from the settlement from the rabbi's family. He was 17 years old. So Soutine originally sets out to be apprenticed with a tailor in Minsk and follow in his father's footsteps. Instead, he gets off the train at Vilnius and enrolls in art school. At 20, After studying art in the Academy of Vilnius for 3 years, he moved to Paris and he moved into La Roche. There, he lived and worked alongside other Jewish emigre artists and befriended Amedeo Modigliani, who became a close friend and who had a great influence over Soutine's career. Now, this is the only work that I had associated with Chaim Soutine. This particular piece it's only one of 3 of the 9 original paintings from the series that was completed in 1924. Only 3 of them exist. It's clear that his work is intended to be confrontational. It fills the entire canvas and envelops you in a very visceral, literally a very visceral way. Soutine lived the life of a starving artist at La Roche. It wasn't until 1922 that Soutine's fortune changed. Dr. Albert C. Barnes, the Philadelphia-based collector and founder of the Barnes Foundation, came to Europe on a hunt for contemporary paintings. One afternoon, Barnes happened upon Soutine's studio. After meeting Soutine, Barnes purchased 50 of his works. And according to a Barnes Foundation brochure, I quote, "The expressive force of Soutine's paintings, coupled with his image as a struggling bohemian artist living in Paris during the interwar years, imparted a particular influence on a new generation of post-war painters in the United States. Soutine is viewed by many as a herald of American abstract expressionism, and his guttural, richly impasted canvases were presented as an antecedent for contemporary American painting." His work is very remarkable in that it looks like he went at that canvas with a lot of force. He does scraping and dabbing and dotting and splashing. And it's really, when you get up close, it's almost a little disturbing. It looks like the canvas is gonna discharge this swirling paint or these forms. Now, this piece is by Wilhelm de Kooning. Critics state that de Kooning was inspired by Soutine's work. Soutine's canvases of remote villages, blood-soaked carcasses, and portraits of ordinary people were de Kooning's favorite, hands down. The Dutch-born artist once exclaimed, "I've been always crazy about Soutine, all of his paintings." This is my favorite of his landscapes. With the Nazi invasion of Paris in the summer of 1940, Soutine was forced to flee his apartment in Paris for fear of being captured by the Gestapo. The years that followed were horrendous. They were Soutine's darkest. He was forced to move from place to place with forged passports. The stress of living like a hunted man aggravated his ulcers, and he died of a perforated ulcer at 50 years old. Today, Soutine's work is held in the collection at the Barnes, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Tate Gallery in London, the Museum d'Orange in Paris, and Los Angeles County Museum, among others. Now, we're going to move from landscapes that swirl and look like they're going to fly up the canvas to landscapes of serene beauty. We're going to look at landscapes bathed in a spiritual, translucent light. Our next artist is considered one of the most renowned and famous Israeli artists worldwide, with works in collection of leading museums such as MoMA in New York, the Musée de Moderne, Paris, and the Jewish Museum, and many others. Let me introduce you to Raveen Rubin. Raveen Rubin, and you can see his full birth name, was born to a poor Romanian Jewish Hasidic family. He was the 8th of 13 children. At 19, in 1912, he left the Ottoman-ruled Palestine to study art in Jerusalem, finding himself at odds with his academy teachers. He left for Paris and moved into LaRouche. He moved in 1913 to pursue his studies at the École des Beaux-Arts. At the outbreak of World War I, he returned to Romania, where he spent the war years. In 1923, Rubin immigrated to Mandate, Palestine. His paintings use radiant, earthy colors and techniques reminiscent of the work of Marc Chagall. Rubin met his wife, Esther, in 1928 aboard a passenger trip to Palestine on his return from a show in New York City. She was a Bronx girl who had won a trip to Palestine in the Young Judea competition. My granddaughter met her husband in the birthright in Israel. So I got a kick out of that story. Rubin's landscape portray the landscapes and inhabitants of Israel in a sensitive fashion. His landscape paintings in particular pay special attention and detail to this sort of spiritual translucent light. You'll see at the bottom, he signs his name in Hebrew and English. His first name in Hebrew and his second name in English letters. Recurring themes in his work were the biblical landscapes. Many of his paintings are sun-drenched depictions of Jerusalem and the Galilee. In 1948, he became the first official Israeli diplomat, envoy / minister to Romania, and he served in that position till 1950. Now we leave him, and we're going to see what critics have called the quintessential Jewish artist of the 20th century, Marc Chagall. He was the first of 9 children in a Lithuanian Jewish Hasidic family near the city of Vitebsk, Belarus, which was then part of the Russian Empire. He was born of a family steeped in religious life. His parents were observant Hasidic Jews who found spiritual satisfaction in a life defined by their faith and organized by prayer. At the time of his birth, the Vitebsk population was about 66,000 folk. Half of that population were Jewish. It was a picturesque city of churches and synagogues, and it was called Russian Toledo, after the cosmopolitan city of the former Spanish Empire. As the city was built mostly of wood, little of it survived years of occupation and destruction during World War II. Chagall was associated with several major artistic styles and created works in a wide range of artistic formats, including painting, drawing, book illustration, stained glass, stage sets, ceramic, tapestry, and fine art prints. Oh, now, life was not easy in his village. This is what he wrote, and I found this picture to go with it. The street lamps are out. I feel panicky, especially in front of the butcher's window. There you can see calves that are still alive, lying beside the butcher's hatchets and knives. When asked by a pogromnist, Jew or not, Chagall remembered thinking, my pockets are empty, my fingers sensitive, my legs weak, and they are out for blood. My death would be futile. I wanted so to live. Chagall denied being a Jew. The pogromnik shouted, all right, get along. Ultimately, he escaped that life, and from 1910 to 1914, Chagall lived in Montparnasse at La Ruche. It was during this period that Chagall painted some of his most famous paintings of his Jewish shtetl, his village, and developed the features that became recognizable trademarks of his art. This is his first self-portrait. He was about 25 years old at the time. It was painted in his first Paris studio in La Ruche, where he and like 200 other artists lived in very poor conditions. Besides the artists we talked about today, there were artists whose names you might recall, like Picasso and Miro and Barak and Mondrian, among others. Chagall spent most of his life in Paris, but he never stopped returning to Belarus in his mind and in his art. In the self-portrait with 7 fingers, there are 2 landscapes hovering above the painter. I showed you what the studio looked like. So he was in a room with no windows. So these are his images. His new home in Paris hovered to the left, and the memories of childhood village in Belarus. Chagall's Jewish heritage shows really strongly in much of his work, with references to traditional folk tales, fables, and beliefs. In this painting, Chagall refers to the colorful Yiddish folk expression, mit all 7 Finger, which means with all 7 fingers. And the meaning of that is, I'm working as fast, as hard as possible. Marc Chagall is probably most identified with the theme of the wandering Jew, more so than any other modern artist. Chagall himself identified with the image of the wandering Jew, both in terms of his personal life and more generally as an artist who serves as a witness to history. He has an earlier painting of his, of the wandering Jew with a hovering over a Russian village. Chagall portrays the wandering Jew here as a spectator, as a witness to history. Chagall's work often is painted in strong and bright colors, portraying the world with a dreamlike simplicity and a fusion of fantasy and nostalgia for life in the Jewish villages of Eastern Europe. He often stated that he realized that the Jewish traditions in which he had grown up were fast disappearing and that he needed to document them. And this is a painting he did at La Roche called The Holy Coachman. Chagall's nostalgic cultural and religious legacy is highlighted by the figure of the violinist dancing in a rustic village. The Chabad Hasidim of Chagall's childhood believed it possible to achieve communion with God through music and dance, and the fiddler was a vital presence in ceremonies and festivals. Chagall met his muse, Bella Rosenfeld, in 1909, and he continued to depict his devotion to her and the tenderness of their relationship well after her death. Reflecting on his first meeting of Bella, Chagall explained, "Her silence is mine, her eyes mine. I feel she has always known me, my childhood, my present life, my future, as if she were watching over me, divining my innermost being, though this is the first time I have seen her. I knew that this is she, my wife. Her pale coloring, her eyes, how big and round and black they are. They are my eyes, my soul." Chagall did several wonderful paintings that focused on the bride as the major theme of a painting, and included were features that were found in many other European artworks. You can see one here, but animals that play music. Now this painting from 1915, and it's Brooding, this seemed to be quite a departure from most of the work that I've studied of his. It was as if he was foretelling, or it was a foretelling or like a harbinger of what was to come. On the outbreak of World War II, Chagall was forced to flee Paris, first to the Lorraine region and then further south, transporting carts of his artworks with each move. Not only was Chagall Jewish, but the Nazis had also labeled him a degenerate artist. He spent 2 years dodging the Third Reich. He was even once seized on a raid in Marseille, but he was released because of American intervention. At one point, Alfred H. Barr, the director of the New York Museum of Art, invited Chagall to have a solo exhibition as a ploy for obtaining a US visa. Supported by Jewish American organizations and collectors who paid for their passage, the artist and his wife Bella seized this ticket out and departed from France as soon as they could. Now, when they arrived in America, they decided that the Spanish customs had impounded his art-filled crates. A distressed Chagall wrote to his daughter Ida, who was stranded in southern France, and she began a historic and heroic effort to salvage her father's works from being lost to the war. She traveled during wartime by herself to Spain and somehow succeeded in getting the crates released. Although Chagall remained most emphatically a Jewish artist whose work was one long dreamy reverie of his life in his native village, he saw his work as not the dream of one person, but a dream for all humanity. There is a French Chagall National Museum, the Chagall Biblical Message, and it's built in Nice in 1973. It houses a series of 17 paintings illustrating the biblical message of Genesis, Exodus, and the Song of Songs. They were painted and offered to the French state in 1966 by Chagall. You know, Chagall received many prizes and many recognitions for his work throughout his lifetime. And just as a major retrospective was closing in London, he passed away quietly in St. Paul de Vence, France, on March 1985. He was 98 years old. In summary, the Jewish artists we've highlighted today are some of the most influential artists of our time. They painted their dreams, fantasy, personal histories, private images, and mythology. These Jewish artists opened up a world of possibility, a world that is more than we can see directly, and provided a wealth of new inspiration for the artists that followed. The next talk is a series featuring women artists, and it's called Women of Substance. Great Jewish women painters have contributed to all modern art movements. Some achieved fame, but many remained little known to this day. And believe me, it would be my pleasure to introduce you to some of the most beautiful and intriguing paintings of the 20th century done by Jewish women artists. Before I go, I want to share this quote by Chagall. If I create from the heart, nearly everything works. If from the head, almost nothing. Thank you for this afternoon. You were a wonderful, quiet audience. Now I want to hear you speak, and hope to see you next week, same time, same place.